So Ken, how about if I kick it off?
Yeah, kick it off.
Okay. Get a rolling start. So, hello, everybody. I'm Gary Berg-Cross, co-chair of this summit's Ontology Summit. And I want to welcome you to the March 1st, 2023 session, which is on a panel. I want to give you a little bit of a background, and I actually have a few slides. So as I spoke to people about organizing the summit this year, one of the panelists who's here, Christoph Janowitz, suggested that it would be useful to have a more general discussion as part of the summit. So we've had some very rich sessions talking about processes, practices, and tools, and they're part of a system. So I thought it would be good to reflect on that. It might cross several topic areas of the sessions and even more general issues. And also, since this has been a biomedically oriented discussion, we invited some distinguished researchers who represent other domains, and so they can add their point of view about how they view the biomedical ontologies, the practices, what they might use, what might be different. So before I introduce the panel and turn it over to my co-chair, James, who organized these first sessions that I just sort of mentioned, I have a few slides that I hope will provide some context for discussion. You see the first one here, and this also might be useful for people who haven't been part of prior sessions, or since we saved the video and put it out on YouTube eventually and on the link on the site. If people sort of view this, they might be able to get a better idea about what they're missing from other sessions. So what I've done with a few slides as providing context is to actually leverage material from the OBO community, OBO Foundry community, and some prior sessions, just a little bit, to give a little bit of the flavor of what, at least from my perspective, I think is important to understand. So one is that this is very much a community effort dedicated and devoted to developing what's called a library of ontologies, like a repositories of ontologies, that are not only open, but they are modular and interoperable. And they have a quality of being logically all formed, so that good semantics, and as part of a domain, they're scientifically accurate. And also noted on this slide is that it's very much a participatory community. It's, as mentioned before, it's open use, it's collaborative, so people collaborate together, leveraging prior work, how things relate and so forth. The idea is modular also, that there would be non-overlapping and strictly scoped content to these things. And a good example of this is the gene ontology, which is sort of a centerpiece of this. And also the idea is leveraging not only a common syntax, but semantic relations. So I've used this slide from it's a fairly complicated slide from the OBO Foundry community, prior presentations. You see a little bit of a life cycle going on. It's fairly complicated. It has a number of roles, as mentioned here, starting with a database curator and an ontology curator. But on the other side, we have things that are maybe people are a little bit more familiar with, which is the idea of ontology engineer and developer, along with a more specialized role of an ontology pipeline specialist. And I've just sort of circled a few of the things that might be recognizable to people. And I put in the diagram a few of the tools that we have been presented as part of this. And while it's the idea of these tools is to automate repetitive tasks, as an example, and write scripts and things of that nature, you can see that there's a lot of specialization in terms of roles, but the idea of this summit is also to make these things useful and usable by scientists and researchers who might not have all these specialties, but understand how to work together and the various roles that are involved. Now, this slide, again, very complicated, was something that was presented by both Chris and by Nico, who created the slide. And it sort of related our sessions to this pyramid idea about how the Foundry sort of works and provides interoperability, some ontology and semantics. Starting at the bottom, it's essentially driven by lots of data and so forth, things that become formalized as you go up the pyramid. And on the left side, we see some of the things that were talked about that help manage the data, turning it into knowledge, and make the models usable. So we have things like the RO, Relational Ontology Standardization, OMO for metadata, annotations of ontologies, and the COB, Core Ontology for Biology and Biomedicine, I should say. And on the right side, again, we have a lot going on there. But under common format and tools, we have things like robot and APIs and Oak and things of that nature. And so others may make a little bit more of this, but it provides a view of what we've covered and what's valuable. And I have the question on the top about what about interoperability outside the OBO Foundry? So there's a lot of things here that help interoperability within OBO Foundry. What of it can be used outside? And of course, people like Chris and James have talked about how things like robot certainly can be used outside of OBO, but are they being used? Now, this slide, would have been close to my last slide, actually two more, but is also taken from the OBO literature. I think it was OBO Academy. And I thought it was a very good, fair slide, providing a view about how there are lots of things that are hard about building ontologies. But of course, the effort is to make it easier enough that non-expert people over time can, with help, do something. So it mentions the idea of the foundries primarily and fundamentally bottom up. And we heard about the Ubergraph, for example, about putting data, a huge amount of data into a manageable, queryable form. But it notes that there are things that are hard to reach agreement on. And one of them, for example, in COB is, what's the scope of COB? And it has an example here of the varied elements, the conceptualization that might go into measurements and a datum of measurements and a recording medium and so forth. Also, another issue is how do we encode synonyms? And then to satisfy all the layers of that pyramid that we saw requires a coordinated level of expertise. We saw a number of roles that are involved. They mentioned, for example, something I've been interested in and some of our other panelists are interested in is shared ontology design patterns require some knowledge of how to do that. And we may hear more about that later on. And also a favorite topic of mine is reusing shared vocabularies requires knowledge about a variety of OWL semantics and things of that nature. So the point is, it has been difficult. The question is, where are we in terms of managing this difficulty and making it more available for people? So for my last quick slides, one from Chris, or two from Chris here, is just the idea. It shows you how COB, this core ontology for biomedicine, sort of leverages things. And one of its intent, an important intent for making things easier, is hide some degree of complexity, but at the same time, providing logical axioms that allow us to understand if when we're building these things, there are inconsistencies between these. This is particularly important when we're talking about modular ontology that need to fit together, and we're trying to do that. So a question that we had as part of Chris's earlier presentation is, what's the relation of COB to other upper domain cores? And we had Thorsten Hammond, who made a few comments on things out of the geospatial area. My final slide for this section is essentially looking at COB and BAFO. And BAFO is in the gray area above with very general things like entities. And in yellow, we have things that are more biomedically oriented and specific, going down to material entity, which has lots of subtypes. And the point here I would make is that this type of concept is common to many domains. We might not have cells in every domain, but we have molecules and things of that nature. So with that, let me come back to, I'll stop sharing, I guess, here. Let me come back to our panel and let me introduce the panel. We have four members. The first is James Overton, my co-organizer and co-chair of the summit, who has a PhD from the University of Western Ontario and runs a consultancy, as he calls it, called Nocean, Knocean. He has spent 10 plus years of experience in developing various ontologies, such as the Ontology for Biomedical Investigations, OBI, and many others, and is a mainstay of the OBO Foundry community. He developed in an earlier session and reported on the robot tool here. Second is Dr. Chris Mungle, who has a PhD from the University of Edinburgh School of Biological Sciences and is a staff scientist in the Environmental Genomics and System Biology Division at LBNL, where he heads the Biosystems Data Science Department and leads a group of working on the application of computational techniques to problems in life sciences of relevance to the health of humans and health of the planet as a whole. Chris's research interests center around the capture, computational integration, and dissemination of biological research data and the development of methods for using this data to elucidate biological mechanisms and underpinning the health of humans and the planets again. He and his team have led the creation of key biological ontologies. The gene ontology is one of these. Chris's main interest, he mentions, is the application of AI, knowledge-based methods, and biocuration to advance our understanding and the interconnection and the role of genes and genetic mechanisms in key biological processes. Dr. Christoph Janowitz holds a PhD in geoinformatics in 28 and a diploma in ecology 2013 from Munster University. He's a professor of geoinformatics at the University of Virginia, as well as a professor of geographic information science and geoinformatics at the geology department and the director of the Center for Spatial Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Jano, along with Pascal Hitzler, is the editor-in-chief of the Semantic Web Journal. At UCSB, he runs the STKO lab, which investigates the role of space and time for knowledge organizations. Conceptually, Jano describes his research niche lying in the combination of theory-driven, that is, knowledge engineering, and data-driven, that is, data mining techniques to improve the representation, publication, discovery, and reuse of geographic and environmental data. And he presented last year on some well-known work that he leads on the knowledge graph. Our fourth panelist is Kogan Shimizu, who has to replace Deborah McGinnis, who was unable to attend at the last minute. Kogan has a PhD under Pascal Hitzler from Kansas State University and is now an assistant professor in computer engineering at Wright State University. At our launch session, he spoke on advancing modular ontology engineering. You will have more to say about these methodologies and tools next week. And with that, let me turn it over to James.
Thanks, Gary. For that introduction to the kind of topics, and also to all our speakers today. Thanks very much, all the panelists. You counted me as a panelist, but I'm not planning to say very much. I'm just going to moderate today. And I'd encourage everyone to ask questions like in the chat. We'll have lots of time for questions. But first, I'm going to give the speakers a chance to talk. I did ask Chris to present a few slides. And so I'm going to invite him to speak first, and then we can see if Christoph or Kogan want to present a few slides. Otherwise, we'll go straight into discussion. So Chris, please take it away.
All right. Thanks, James. And thanks, Gary. You actually made my job really easy. It's really nice to hear from someone who is like not, partly an outsider to the OVO community, gives such a wonderful kind of clear description of everything in it. So I feel I don't have so much to to say here, but maybe I want to give a slightly different perspective, and maybe coming from a bit more of a user perspective, because most of my day-to-day work is not interacting with kind of like awesome advanced ontology engineers such as yourselves. It's, I work with kind of like, a lot of, scientists who are being told to make their data fair, or who are trying to kind of like analyze data that may be annotated using our ontologies. But they're, let's face it, it's ontologies can be kind of confusing if you're coming from the outside and you're being told that, on the one hand, that you have to navigate these kind of like complex upper level hierarchies with lots of very abstract concepts. And then at the underlying technical level, you've got kind of exchange formats, RDF XML based on OWL semantics. And you go, okay, what's this OWL thing? You go to the W3C documentation and you get lots of, very nice, to us, very nice kind of like formal descriptions of what all the different constructs in OWL mean. But it doesn't really map very well to kind of like the everyday tasks that a lot of people who should be using our ontologies can readily grasp. So, this is true of both kind of like, scientists and data scientists and bioinformaticians and people who are trying to do things like build knowledge graphs from our ontologies and kind of query them. This slide is from one of Jim's Ubergraph presentations that we heard about. Even just the, something that we might think would be simple, which is like trying to find the list of all chemical entity participants in a biological process, can be kind of hard when you do something like query Sparkle over the underlying OWL representation. So another perspective on some of the great talks that we've heard so far is that it's really about kind of providing kind of a buffering kind of layer on some of these more complex abstractions. So I talked about the COB, Core Ontology for Biology and Medicine, which provides a more of a simplified layer, user-friendly layer underneath Buffo. And then on the kind of technical OWL side, we heard about the ODK and and robot and how to do kind of template OWL design patterns, how to use something like Ubergraph that kind of does the job of combining these different ontologies together, linking them, makes it easy to query, provides all the kind of inferences that you need up ahead of time. So, I hope this has been like really useful for you all to hear about some of these tools that we found very useful within the biomedical sphere that, hopefully you will, those of you who are outside that sphere will also find useful. So again, kind of like COB, as Gary showed, provides this more user-friendly layer with kind of like terms, upper level terms that can be reused across ontologies, but are hopefully more understandable to ordinary scientists, such as subatomic particle or organism or population and so on. Here's some examples of how some of these terms from existing OBO domain ontologies may reuse some of these upper level terms. And then the basic idea with templated design patterns as well is that this can act as a buffer onto the more complex OWL axiomatization. So you maybe have like an OWL expert who maybe fewer in number and more in demand can work on defining these templates, which I think of as kind of like Mad Libs for ontologies. You basically kind of like come up with a template and little slots that can be filled in. And then maybe the kind of like the domain expert who is not familiar with the underlying OWL here can essentially just go and fill in these Mad Libs and say, I want a term that is, transport from like the nucleus to the Golgi that is transporting some particular kind of molecular entity. They can basically kind of manage these essentially as spreadsheets, and then behind the scenes using tools like Robot or DOS-DPs, these can be compiled into OWL. You get the reasoning, you get the auto classification from the reasoning, you get the validation from the reasoning, and so on. But you don't need to kind of expose that to the people who are like directly contributing some of the terms here. And so, yeah, I like to think of this in terms of maybe a slightly different pyramid where you've got like people like the people who are both domain experts and OWL experts who can do things like create the design patterns. Then the ontology developers don't need to interact with the more complex OWL on a day-to-day basis. And then the actual kind of like underlying users here are consuming ontologies that are already kind of like pre-reasoned and joined together using some of the tools like Robot and ODK that we heard about. So hopefully you've got a sense of some of the the fantastic tooling that the OBO technical team has produced over these last series of talks. But one thing I really want to try and communicate here, that it's harder to kind of like get this for this to kind of like come through from some of the more technical talks. But something that is just really special to me about OBO is the community. We've got a very large community where people with diverse ranges of experience can kind of like mix together and kind of like just really figure out, we're not building things purely from the top down and imposing them on people. It's really a kind of like a collaborative conversation with a wide range of people that helps us kind of like build tools that are both help us enforce kind of like rigor and standards in our ontologies, but also hopefully make it easier for people as well. And this to me is one of the the really key aspects about OBO. And so I think that was the last slide I had there. So
thanks, Chris. Those are great slides. Yeah, and I'm hoping to give lots of fodder for questions that we'll turn to in a minute. But the next thing is we'll give a chance for Christoph to speak, either about what you just saw or anything that you want to present on as our next panelist. So Christoph, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, James. I checked back with Gary and he said that we don't need to have slides ready, so I don't have any. I'm ready to dive right into the discussion and see where we can take this. By the way, I am representing also the Noel Graph project, as some of you may know, just as Kogan, which is an integration of, millions and millions, in fact, billions and billions of statements from many, many different data layers, ranging, from certain parts of human health all the way to environment and soil sciences and stuff like this. So I also am a big believer in ontologies and their task and integration. Maybe that's it for me.
Thanks, Christoph. And yeah, Kogan, can we turn it over to you for a minute?
Yeah, sure. I'm kind of in the same boat since I was such a late addition to the panel. I didn't really have any time to put into any slides, but I'm excited to provide any sort of insight into maybe a different world for ontology use and adoption. So that'll be kind of interesting to see where the discussion goes from here. All
right, great. I am happy to kick off the discussion, but if there's anyone who is just chomping at the bit to jump in with a question for our panelists or the community here today, then put up your hand and or just jump in and ask a question. Gary, your hand is up.
Yes, I just wanted to know, Kogan and Jano could maybe address this. We've heard a lot about very useful tools within the OBO Foundry, and I'm just wondering whether you've used any of those and or what other alternate tools you might use that might sort of be similar to what they do.
You mean similar to the ones presented earlier, like robot and
yes, and you might even do it based on the function within ontological engineering that you might know of, for the different roles for ontological engineering that were sort of highlighted in one of my slides. I was just interested to see how it matches up with other tools and other approaches. And I certainly would know that would be the case with ontology, with the ontology design patterns, the modules that might be. Chris mentioned, for example, templates, templating. Is there anything comparable like that?
So yeah, this is something that I'll dig into pretty deeply next week with my talk on modules and patterns, which I think is maybe perhaps no surprise. Yes, the idea of having a sort of template that you can use to assemble an ontology a lot more quickly than if you did not have the template kind of persists across most of software engineering and all of its subdisciplines, right? So you have the software design patterns that kind of broadly inform how software architecture works. We also have ontology design patterns for both structural components, which are what is the best way to model a certain type of relationship, as well as content or domain-oriented patterns, which are, this is a pattern that frequently occurs within a particular domain, and this is a good way of modeling it that has been peer-reviewed or follows established best practices, or indeed reuses these so-called architectural or structural patterns that I mentioned. I can provide lists and examples of these next week, but I don't have a good way of demonstrating those at the moment. There are a couple of tools that we do use to model with patterns pretty quickly. One is the commodity or the comprehensive modular ontology integrated development environment, which is a plugin for Protege, which allows you to graphically assemble and connect multiple patterns. It's a research prototype, so it's not the most polished of tools, but it is functional and mostly effective. And you can download it from the plugins page if you check for plugin updates on Protege and play around with it. But yeah, I'll let Jano provide any insight as to our knower graph tooling as well.
Well, I think there are two things here for the development of the graph and maintaining this, very large 12 or 13 billion statement, large knowledge graph. I think there's a real still lack of certain kinds of tools that were commonly developed in the early days of what at that time was called linked data, but most of them being university projects are no longer maintained. So we are a little bit in a limbo where some of the software that you can commercially get, like GraphDB, have fantastic tooling support, and then there's a little bit of existing projects still out in the open. But for something like even a visual interface, like a faceted browser that would be geo-enabled, all of this was there at some stage, and then it fell apart, and we had to custom design this, so to speak. When it comes to the ontologies, Kogan will talk next week about commodity, and there's certainly more, and of course all the proteges, web proteges, and so on. But looking at, for instance, what we did, I'm also one of the editors of the SOSA and SSN ontologies, very frequently used ontologies about observations, measures, and so on, that are both W3C and OGC standards. For those, honestly, we just used, like a little bit of Protege and text editors to make diff easier, right? So where we come from, we don't, at least for me, there's no specific need for complex tooling beyond what is there, like, the web proteges and proteges of this world.
Mm-hmm. So pushing on that just a little bit more, you don't tend to use OWL API, for example, or I don't know, OWL reasoners in the work that you're describing?
We totally are using OWL reasoners, right? They are reasonings, of course, part of GraphDB, for instance, which is our technical backbone. Big shout out to them for providing us a license. And of course, Hermit and other reasoners are part of Protege. Yeah, so they are everyday experience, right? But I do have to say, I don't want to play Pascal Hitzler here. Pascal Hitzler can play Pascal Hitzler himself. But if I would be Pascal Hitzler, I would be saying that these days reasoning is a little bit overrated, right? This is not where the real meat of ontology engineering sits, and I do agree with Pascal. And by the way, we also use shackle shapes. So just that I don't come across as ignorant of all this. We do use this quite a bit, but it's the same tooling. If I would have been on the panel 3 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago, you would hear me talk about the very same tools that we are using today, at least for me.
Yeah, I think this speaks to some kind of very interesting points here that, I think all of us here are very much in favor of tool reuse, and we'd love to see OBO tools reused more outside the OBO community, and you would love to see other tools used by us. But maybe some of this, speaks to the fact that we're actually tackling slightly different problems. And when I say ontology, or a member of the OBO community says ontology, we have a certain picture in our mind of a certain shape. It's a large terminological structure with kind of thousands of classes that needs to be automatically, maintained by OWL reasoning. Maybe outside the OBO community, you say ontology, and people think something that looks maybe more like a schema, a lightweight schema with on the order of tens or hundreds of classes that is maybe better managed using something like Shackle or Shex. So I think this is, to me, the really interesting challenge is actually getting at some of the underlying kind of use cases and the problems that we're trying to tackle, and seeing what some of the commonalities are there, and then coming back and saying, how do we look at the tool landscape and kind of figure out the best way to reuse?
I think that's a really, really great comment. Thanks, Chris. Yes, our ontologies are in fact in the realm of a couple of thousands of axioms, clearly not, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of axioms, right? And I wouldn't necessarily call all of them light, so to speak, from the degree of axiomatization. They can make use of the full expressivity of OWL, and sometimes even beyond, right? Depending on what you would like to do there. But I think really, Kogan, jump in if I misrepresent something in your opinion. At least from my perspective, the classical ontology engineering, again, I'm just speaking about my experience, doing this for the last 20 years, and I'm not from the medical domain. And they play a role trying to conceptualize the knowledge of the people you are working with, to reach an agreement between many people you're working with, right? To externalize the verbalized domain knowledge that people have and share and maybe in fact disagree on. So it's a great tool for knowledge modeling. And then we use all the reasoning and what have you to arrive at a working ontology. And then we use all the shackles and what have you whenever we have our data pipelines that load data, triplify data, and then run them across ontologies. But once you have your knowledge graph there, many of the things for performance reasons are materialized. And during the typical Sparkle query, reasoning boils down to RDFS. I'm not, I don't want to overstate this, but at large, I believe that to be true.
Yeah, I think that resonates with us too. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, the other comment I'd make there is that Obo uses a lot of OWL tooling, which is why we ended up building Robot. And we hit scaling problems in a bunch of different directions with OWL API, which basically has to load everything into memory all at once and tends to load like all the annotations, all the strings and everything at once. It just consumes a lot of RAM. So we get to like 1 million classes and things slow down, and we get to a couple million classes and we're in trouble. And so Chris and I and other people have been working on kind of alternative whatever substrates. We've been using SQL for more things. And like Phil Lord has a Rust-based horned owl kind of alternative to OWL API that can do certain things. So we've been pushing. Well, it sounds like you're not having those scaling problems. I'm sure you have different scaling problems with your billions of triples. But yeah, we definitely hit limitations with OWL tooling that we've been investing to push beyond. And then a lot of our reasoning at scale ends up just using ELK, and we don't take full advantage of LDL. But I mean, the general point that Christoph is making is definitely true, that we tend to reason bits and pieces in isolation and then put them into the database, and we don't continue to reason over it at that point. But that does get us most of the benefits that we want.
Just to ping up on that, I also think that for many of the tasks that one envisioned, reasoning could play a role, and especially if you go from the more classical reasoning to other forms of reasoning like similarities and analogies. This way, I think a lot of this is handled by embeddings, so the representation learning literature, so well that we are also refocusing where we need this and where we need something else, right? So a lot of tasks can also be handled simply in very different ways today.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Yeah, I think in our domain as well, the majority of inference that is performed is not your kind of classic deductive inference. It's something performed entirely outside the ontology framework itself, whether it's semantic similarity, which does make some use of ontologies, or just kind of Bayesian reasoning, kind of standard statistical methods and so on. And I think there's a rich domain to be tapped into in unifying these different perspectives. And maybe some of this involves going back to some of the earlier research and knowledge representation, where there was more of a wider play field of different kinds of reasoning. Maybe it didn't even have to be based on first order logic, or open world reasoning, defeasible reasoning and so on. Sometimes these things map more cleanly to the way actual kind of like biologists will reason about things.
Okay. Well, that's a fascinating topic that I would love to just talk about all day, but I would also like to kind of broaden our horizons a little bit and push in a different direction. If there's anyone else who has a question, all right, hands up. How about Ravi, would you like to jump in with a question? And then Nico?
Yes, my question is actually addressed to the panel to react to the concept of various templates or pre-population of information. Just imagine as a use case, I'm a bioscientist. I'm interested in the dynamics of jumping genes. So I'm more concentrating on my scientific object. I don't know enough Sparkle. I don't even know Shackle or the concepts of various logics. what can I do as a scientist? Use these tools as a single template or multiple templates from each of the areas. For example, from Jano's area of geotemporal location, from Chris's area of chemistry and biochemistry, and Kogan from your area. Will I be using one template or more? And will I be populating them at different stages of my application?
Yeah, I guess, the way I think we'll continue to have interesting conversations about templates as we hear some of the future talks in these series about design patterns from Kogan and so on. But, the way we're conceiving of it, it's not, the templates would be more used by people who want to populate terms in the ontology. So if you're like a transposon researcher and you want to contribute terms to the sequence ontology, then the sequence ontology may set up templates that say, here's how we classify different kinds of transposons, for example. But, I'd say for the average researcher who is interested in looking at kind of the dynamics of transposons, maybe ontologies, they're not always the solution to everything. I think a lot of what they might do would be just done using kind of classic sequence analysis. So I hope that helps.
Let me piggyback on what Chris said, Ravi, to answer your question. So a lot of my recent work and also Kogan's work comes from this knowledge graph project, which is a NSF project, which follows this very new idea of what is called convergence accelerator, where you have to bring in industry, government agencies, and multiple domains to really converge on, this common integrated graph of data. And the way how we had to deal with the problems that you described, many people from many parts of, research domains, practitioners, government agencies, most of them don't speak any OL or Shekel or, Spark, whatever you like, RDF, is that we took the decision that at the lower level of our entire graph and all of our ontologies is a very small set of well-known and well-standardized ontologies, like, GeoSparkle and so on, but especially also the source ontology. So everything is represented as an observation, whether this is a specific crop growing somewhere, or this is a certain type of soil, or this is the rate of obesity in a certain community, or this is the distance people have to travel to the next hospital, or a storm moving in. Everything is an observation and properties of these observations, which means there's a minimum interoperability fallback level. You don't need to know anything about the domain, so to speak, and you can still say, show me what happened there, so to speak, or where did this storm happen. And on top of this, and this is the part that mostly Kogan and Pascal are leading, is the richer domain knowledge. And for this to really contribute to different kinds of phenomena, different kinds of soils, different kinds of storms and storm events and how they relate to each other. And for that, of course, to be able to query this and make meaningful contributions both on the retrieval and on the population side, you would indeed need to be a knowledge engineer, right? But for the purely user perspective, all you need is the basic language of sensors, observations, properties they measure, and so on.
Very good. I like that. Thank you. Kogan?
Yeah, so my experience is pretty much in line with what Jana was saying, mostly because we've been working on the same project for many years now. But to add maybe a little bit more here is the notion of treating pieces of an existing ontology as a template. So in many ways, what we've already done is we've established maybe what we would call a reference ontology, or something that we've all necessarily agreed on, but to also some extent that in order to work with nowhere graph stuff, you must adhere in some way to the structure that we have imposed over our data. Or knowledge, right? So if you were to provide new data and new knowledge to nowhere graph, you would have to take that observation conceptualization that Jano mentioned with from SOSA SSN with a little bit of the nowhere graph spice thrown in, and you can essentially treat that very similarly to the template that you've seen from OBO, where instead of an observation at the most top level, you have a specific type of observation, and you essentially use the observation as the template and tweak it to the specific data that you are intending to contribute. This particular strategy is something we're working on for Nowhere Graph, but hasn't quite been made to the public, so to speak, but it's in the pipeline.
Thank you.
All right. Nico's had his hand up for a while, so I'd like to turn it over to him, and then there's a few more hands in the line.
So yeah, I'm not very familiar with the Nowhere Graph, but I would be interested to hear a little bit about the role of ontologies, and in particular, the role of OBO ontologies, if there are any in the kind of knowledge graph projects in your area. It doesn't have to be just Nowhere Graph, but anything that lives in your space. And then with a little bit of a focus on the question of how important is a high quality ontology if you use it or reuse it or integrate it in your knowledge graph project, if you are actually integrating such ontologies in your knowledge graphs.
I can start with that. So I think it is important to distinguish between quality and usability, because there are sometimes extremely high quality ontologies that we run into that tend to be so opaque or extremely overfitted to their, well, overfitted seems to be quite negative, very, very, very closely fitted to the domain. And that can make reuse very difficult if you're coming at it from a project with slightly different conceptualizations or slightly different use cases. And so a lot of what we tend to do is to re-implement specific things from existing ontologies and then connect backwards to them, saying like, this is where we're reusing the sort of kernel structure from an existing ontology and say, this is really the same as this thing. But when we need to, we can kind of make our own changes. So essentially making local overrides, I suppose. But to answer your first question about what else is in the space, the next largest, or one of the other knowledge graphs in the sort of Convergence Accelerator program is SPOKE, which is the Scalable Precision Medicine Open Knowledge Engine out of UCSF, which is Sergio Berenzini. And they have a whole bunch of biomedical and gene data. So like they've knowledge graphified like UniProt, Kemble, connected it to gene ontology stuff. And one of the things that we're actively working on, we have bi-weekly calls with them, is providing crosswalks between Nowhere Graph, which is really a geospatial backbone, and the sort of biomedical side of things, which comes from SPOKE.
So are then, other than Go, you just mentioned Go, are there full OBO ontologies used in any of these graphs that you're saying, or full mirrored OBO ontologies, or not?
That is a good question, and I will look it up and get back to you. Off the top of my head, SPOKE would be the closest thing that I know of, but it's not necessarily maybe they don't, but I'll go ahead and look, and I'll pass on a link.
They also use a little bit of a different technological platform. They see them, same for me as for Kogan. I'm not from the SPOKE project. You can look them up. A great project from a UCSF. But in my understanding, they're basically an integrator of terms of all these different ontologies, and then they put them into a common Neo4j infrastructure, and then get API access to you. So it's not that you would be adding any terms there or something like this. Is more the other way around, right? You can look up terms from their combined set of ontologies and then relate your medical knowledge or your examination results or whatever back to them. But check them out. I think they're doing absolutely fantastic work. As far as we are concerned, we are, as Kogan said, we are reusing ontologies. We are designing a lot of our own ontologies. I don't think that we are using any OBO ontologies, but that's not for for disliking or any other reasons. It's just that currently we don't have any application areas where we would see a need for that. If you have some, we would love to know about them, and we would love to collaborate and grow the family together.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Chris is mentioning in the chat that Spoke does use OBO in a few different ways. Did you want to say anything more than that, Chris?
We should probably move on to the next question. Yeah, I can definitely.
Great. The next hand that I saw was Ditch. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Bit of
Are you
feedback,
able to hear
but...
me? I'm not sure if my microphone is any. Yeah, I'm a very, very basic user of ontologies and trying to get into the basics of curation. So I hope this isn't too basic a question, but I have looked for information in the OBO Foundry information, and I can't find it. So I'm just wondering, and like I said, it's very basic. How are different ontologies connecting instances to their ontologies, or how do users connect instances to ontologies? So data that may be found in publications or videos or photos or events that have happened, where are people locating those actual instances and making the direct connections? Because I'm working with NBO at the moment, and I'm trying to do some work that's going to affect other ontologies. So I'm looking to see how what I hope to do is going to affect another ontology's use of a class that we've got, for example. But how could I find out what users are going to find some part of a database that they've got or something get disconnected because I happen to obsolete a term? I don't know if my question makes any sense.
It's a great question. We could probably get distracted by the use of the term instance, which many people interpret different ways, like in Spoke, the genes maybe are instances. But I think what you're speaking to here is really, just more usages of terms. And this has been a kind of like it's a constant challenge. There's a tension between the needs of an ontology to adapt to a domain, to change the way they're modeling certain things, to obsolete concepts that maybe made sense 10 years ago but don't make sense anymore. So on the one hand, the ontology needs to move forward. On the other hand, there's a large number of kind of like users, not all of them whom are visible. So we're actively kind of working on the different strategies for doing this. If you have something like the gene ontology, you've got a relatively well integrated community that meets regularly, and we can have conversations where we say, okay, we plan to obsolete this term. We put a tag on it and we say, this is going to be obsoleted in 6 months. Here's a GitHub issue if you want to protest this obsolescence. And there's a kind of conversation that happens, but not everyone sees these, and sometimes people can be kind of like caught unawares. This is particularly challenging for ontologies like the sequence ontology, which I would estimate there's probably trillions of instances of sequence ontology terms in all the different GFF and genomics files that exist everywhere. And so it's very hard for the sequence ontology community to know who is using terms, but at the same time, there's a real need for the sequence ontology to move forward. So there's various kind of technical approaches we've taken, like standard metadata tags to say, we plan to obsolete this term, various kind of like methodologies like using GitHub issues to be very transparent about it. But ultimately it comes down to building a community for your ontology and having good communication between the ontology developers and all of the different users. And this can be hard because it's, I always find that there's people using your ontologies that you just never imagined and using them in all kinds of strange and imaginative ways. So it takes a lot of effort to kind of go out and reach that community, and everyone's like very busy. They don't want to be monitoring GitHub issue trackers, but it really comes down to kind of like building that community and having good links to the community, so you can communicate your intended changes and do things in a way that moves the ontology forward without being too disruptive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a great question, and I just want to say a couple different things that build on what Chris is saying, but maybe just in a different direction. Like I've been doing open source development for 20 years. The fact that you don't know who your users are and have no control over them is just essential, and you just have to embrace it. You can't fight it because you're not going to win. And so you just have to embrace it and change your attitude about things. But for me, that has meant like just being a zealot about backwards compatibility and just not breaking stuff that people have that's working. And that's and to my perspective, it's a matter of like building trust. And so when it comes to robot, like that software, I'm adamant about backwards compatibility. And then when it comes to our ontologies, we make sure never to drop identifiers. So you can always look up the identifier, and whether it's been obsoleted and replaced or not, you'll always be able to find that identifier. So just supporting legacy applications and not breaking people's stuff is super important. And it is a bit of a change of a mindset if you're coming from closed source software or a database. Rob has had his hand up for quite a while. So Rob, you have the floor.
Thanks. Just some observations and I guess a broad question, but also about a specific effort question as well from the presentations. I wasn't able to attend some of the previous ones, so I guess I'll have to ask now. But the topic is on some shared natural language words. So some previous slides mentioned that there are some natural language terms that may be used in more than one topic or more than one discipline. And the observation I wanted to make is that when it comes to ontologies, depending on the ontology, it's not necessarily, let me rephrase that, the natural language phrase or the term may be the same across a number of domains, but the given meaning is not necessarily the same, particularly with respect to any upper ontology used. So in the case of a number of OBO ontologies which use a particular upper level ontology, the phrase itself, the string, the natural language word may be the same, but the given meaning that is provided at the higher level of abstraction from the upper ontology makes certain philosophical and metaphysical assumptions that the domain professionals do not necessarily think of, agree with, or even want. And so the phrase itself may be the same, but not the meaning. And so this is something that is often overlooked because you have to look at all levels of abstraction to understand what you're committing to in terms of semantics. And so while tool reuse is great when it comes to ontologies, it's not simply about tools. There's semantics, which is not about necessarily a neutral tool, but rather a non-neutral semantic product. And so I'm wondering what the panel has to say about that, and also more specific effort example. So I agree with Chris's points and goals with Cobb about making ontology content in the Foundry more understandable because of the presence of the given upper ontology, which often is confusing and perhaps overly complicated for some. However, there is a gap that I've communicated before that does not quite reach that goal. And so I'm wondering how this gap might be addressed. So basically it's a specific example of that. So the upper ontology is still there, but hiding it doesn't really change the fact that the semantics are still imported. And so the domain level data is still committing effectively to that understanding, which again, may not be desired or agreed upon by domain experts. They may not think in those terms. And so the metaphysical assumptions and so forth are still there. And from an ethical standpoint,
got
I
the
would
question
suggest,
there. Would you like the panelists to answer in the last couple of minutes we've got?
Sure.
I know Chris has things to say about this one.
I do. I would just boil them down to ontologies should use normal scientific terminology that is broadly familiar and use it in non-surprising ways. That's all.
I I went all circle, as odd as this may sound, but I've doing this for more than 20 years. And I went all circle from being a huge fan of early top-level ontologies. At that time, Dolce was very new, called the level 17 before it got its original name. And since many years, I'm not a believer in any top levels anymore. And I believe that also, at least in my domain, that has also resonated. And I think some of them would be really interested in a more detailed reply, Chris, by you about what you hinted to. But I believe what you hinted to, saying, ontologies should use scientific terms that are in real use by real people and on the level that scientists work. That's I couldn't put it more nicely. I believe that we seem to be in line when it comes to the need for a distinction between metaphysics, which I think is very, very important in many domains, and then information ontologies, which serve, at least for us, mainly the purpose of externalizing knowledge, interoperability, and so on, improved information retrieval. And at least for us, people are querying for storms and for soils and for landslides. They are not querying for amounts of matter, for instance.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the answer to that question as well. Nika had a point in the chat that I want to emphasize, just saying there's many communities emerging, like OntoCommons or Industry Ontology Foundry or FDI for Chem, building ontology communities. And he's interested, and I'm also interested in understanding like how the experience we have building the OBO community or toolboxes and workflows and other things could help with those communities, or whether we could learn from them. Either one would be really amazing. So yeah, I want to thank our panelists and also Gary for that great introduction today. I want to thank everyone who asked questions today. And yeah, next week we're going to have another session. Kogan is going to present on ontology design patterns, which you mentioned today. And yeah, that's going to be another great chance for us to kind of compare and contrast a bunch of things that I know with a bunch of things that I don't know. And that's been what's so great about this summit series. All right, thanks everybody. Talk to you next week.